The architecture of disappearance. A man's journey from useless to found. When your own son tells you you're useless, you have two choices: believe him or rebuild yourself from the ground up. You spend your whole life building something. A career, a home, a family. You follow the blueprint they give you. Work hard, provide, be present, be reliable. You pour yourself into it, like concrete into a foundation, believing that the structure you're creating will outlast you, that it will be your legacy. And for 42 years, I did just that. I was Arthur Bell, Vice President of Logistics at Meridian International. Not just an EVP. I was the Arthur Bell, the man who could orchestrate the movement of goods across 3 continents like a conductor leading a symphony. The man who could solve a supply chain crisis before most people had finished their first cup of coffee. The man whose phone rang at all hours because when the impossible needed to happen, they called me. I remember the weight of that title, the satisfaction of it. Arthur Bell, Vice President of Logistics. It wasn't just what I did, it was who I was. When I walked into a room, conversations shifted toward me. When I spoke, people took notes. When a crisis emerged, a hurricane disrupting shipping lanes, a factory fire in Southeast Asia, a dock strike in Hamburg, my name was the first one mentioned in emergency meetings. I was also a father who coached Little League, who helped with algebra homework until the numbers made my head swim, who fixed leaky faucets and built a treehouse that, I assure you, defied every law of physics but never once wobbled. I was a husband who remembered anniversaries, who brought Helen coffee in bed on Saturday mornings, who danced with her in the kitchen when her favorite song came on the radio. The architecture of my life seemed solid, permanent. Every promotion was another floor added to my tower of significance. Every successful project was another beam reinforcing my sense of purpose. Every "how do you do it, Arthur?" was another brick in the wall of my identity. The peak years, when I was indispensable, let me take you back to a Tuesday in March, 15 years ago. I was 45 then, at what I now recognize was the absolute peak of my powers. The call came at 5:47 a.m. I remember because Helen stirred beside me and mumbled something about "your damn phone" before pulling the pillow over her head. It was our CEO, Richard Hawthorne, and his voice had that particular strain that meant millions of dollars were hanging in the balance. A massive earthquake had struck Japan, devastating the port of Sendai. We had 17 container ships en route, carrying everything from automotive parts to consumer electronics for major clients. The port was closed indefinitely. Our competitors were already calling those clients, smelling opportunity in our crisis. "Arthur," Richard said, "I need you to work miracles. Again." I was out of bed before he finished the sentence. By 6:30 a.m., I was in the office, my team assembling around me like pieces of a well-oiled machine. Maria from shipping manifests, David from port relations, Sarah from client communications. We spread maps across the conference table, made calls to harbor masters in Yokohama, Kobe, Busan. I dispatched teams to physically intercept ships still at sea, rerouting them through alternative ports. For 36 hours straight, we moved those 17 ships like chess pieces across the Pacific. I negotiated emergency berths, expedited customs clearances, coordinated ground transport across unfamiliar territories. I spoke to dock supervisors in broken Japanese, port authorities in Seoul, trucking companies in cities whose names I couldn't pronounce. When the last container was delivered, only 3 days behind schedule instead of the 3 weeks our competitors were quoting, Richard called me into his office. He poured 2 glasses of his private reserve bourbon, something he only did for major victories. "You saved us $23 million, he said, raising his glass, "and more importantly, you saved our reputation. There's no one else who could have done this." That phrase, "no one else," it was like a drug. It coursed through my veins, straightened my spine, made me feel 10 feet tall. I was indispensable. I was Arthur Bell, the man who could move mountains, or at least move 17 ships around them. I should have seen the warning signs even then. The way young Mark, then barely 13, had fallen asleep at the kitchen table waiting for me to help him with his science project. The way Helen had stopped asking when I'd be home for dinner, just left plates covered in the refrigerator. The way my colleagues' admiration was tinged with something that might have been pity when they mentioned their own families. But I was drunk on being needed, on being the solution to problems that seemed unsolvable. I told myself I was building something for them, for Mark and Helen. I was creating a legacy, establishing security, becoming someone worthy of their love and respect. I didn't understand then that there's a difference between being respected and being present, between being admired and being known. The last day, when the architecture crumbles, my retirement party was held on a Friday evening in the Meridian Conference Room overlooking the harbor. The same room where I'd orchestrated so many logistical miracles. They decorated it with photos spanning my 4 decades with the company, me shaking hands with shipping magnates, pointing at wall-sized maps, accepting awards for operational excellence. Richard gave a speech about my irreplaceable contributions and institutional knowledge. My team presented me with a crystal globe because you moved the world. The engraving read, Helen stood beside me, beautiful in her blue dress, smiling at all the right moments, but I caught her glancing at her watch. We both knew the real world was waiting outside this room, and neither of us was entirely sure what that world would look like. My replacement, Jennifer Chen, was brilliantly educated, fluent in 3 languages, hungry in the way I'd once been. During the handover meetings, she asked sharp questions about shipping protocols and vendor relationships. But when I started sharing the deeper knowledge, which port supervisors could be trusted in a crisis, which customs officials responded to pressure versus patience, I saw something flicker across her face. Polite tolerance. She was being respectful to the old man, but her expression said clearly, I'll figure this out my own way. My last day was a Tuesday. I've always found it odd that such monumental life changes happen on ordinary weekdays. I cleaned out my desk methodically. The framed photo of Helen and Mark at Mark's college graduation, the coffee mug from our South Korea office, the small jade elephant a grateful client had given me years ago. 42 years of professional identity fit into 2 cardboard boxes. At 5:30 p.m., I turned off my computer for the last time. The screen went black, and in that dark reflection, I saw the face of a man I wasn't sure I recognized without the office around him. The first week at home was a masterclass in temporal disorientation. I woke at 5:15 a.m., as I had for decades, but there was nowhere to go. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, watching Helen prepare for her day. She worked part-time at an art gallery downtown, a job she'd taken 3 years earlier when she got tired of waiting for me to retire so we could travel together. By Wednesday, I'd organized the garage, cleaned the gutters, and started reading a Tom Clancy novel I'd bought at the airport 2 years earlier. By Friday, I'd finished the novel and started another. By the following Tuesday, I was standing in the kitchen at 2:30 p.m., listening to the silence. It's difficult to explain the quality of that silence to someone who's never experienced it. It wasn't peaceful. It was accusatory. It seemed to whisper, "What now? What are you for now?" The phone, which had once rung constantly, sat silent on its charger. My email inbox, once flooded with urgent requests, contained only spam and newsletters. I started following Helen around the house, offering to help with tasks she'd managed perfectly well for years. I suggested we rearrange the living room furniture. I volunteered to take over the grocery shopping, despite the fact that Helen had developed relationships with the butcher, the baker, the produce manager, a whole social network I'd been too busy to notice. The first time I truly felt in the way was on a Thursday morning 3 weeks in. Helen was hosting her book club, something she'd apparently been doing for 2 years, though I'd never really registered it. I wandered into the kitchen as she was arranging pastries on her good china, preparing coffee in the service she'd inherited from her mother. "Can I help?" I asked, reaching for the coffee pot. She gently took it from my hands. "I've got this, Arthur. Why don't you?" She paused, searching for something for me to do. "Why don't you go read your book? We'll be a few hours." I heard them laughing through the walls of my own house, discussing books I'd never heard of, sharing stories from lives they'd been living while I was orchestrating supply chains. I realized I was a stranger in my own home, an intruder in my wife's established rhythms. The 2 lost years, searching for purpose in all the wrong places. What follows retirement, if you're not careful, is a desperate scramble to replace the identity you've lost. I became a man frantically trying on different versions of himself, none of them fitting properly. First came golf. "All the executives play golf," Helen said gently, as if she were prescribing medicine. I bought the clothes, the clubs, the shoes with the ridiculous spikes. I took lessons from a 22-year-old pro named Brad who called me Mr. Bell, with the kind of patience usually reserved for slow children. I hated every minute of it. The arbitrary rules, the hushed reverence for a game that seemed designed to make grown men curse at small white balls. The forced camaraderie of the clubhouse, where recently retired men sat around complaining about their wives and bragging about grandchildren. I quit after 6 weeks, leaving $800 worth of equipment in the garage to gather dust. Helen suggested pottery classes at the community center. "It's creative," she said. "You've always been good with your hands." So I sat in a circle of mostly women, trying to center clay on a wheel while an instructor named Rainbow, I kid you not, talked about finding your inner artist. My bowls looked like ashtrays. My vases resembled twisted car parts. After I accidentally destroyed another student's work during a particularly aggressive attempt at creativity, I stopped attending. The volunteering at the food bank was perhaps the most humbling experience. I'd imagined myself contributing my organizational skills to help the less fortunate. Instead, I found myself standing behind a serving line, spooning mashed potatoes onto plates under the watchful eye of a volunteer coordinator who'd been running the place for 15 years and clearly didn't need advice from a former logistics executive. When I suggested improvements to their distribution system, she smiled and said, "We appreciate your enthusiasm, but we have our own way of doing things." I was being managed politely but firmly, like a well-meaning but clueless newcomer. Which I suppose is exactly what I was. The guitar was Helen's idea after she found me staring out the living room window at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday, still in my pajamas. "Music is supposed to be good for the brain," she said, though her tone suggested she was grasping at straws. I bought an acoustic guitar and downloaded YouTube tutorials. My fingertips developed painful calluses. The simple chord progressions that looked so easy in the videos felt like geometric impossibilities under my clumsy hands. The guitar now sits in the corner of what used to be my home office, a 6-stringed monument to good intentions and poor execution. The worst moment came during what I privately called the kitchen incident. Helen had been making her famous lasagna, a complex, all-day process that she'd perfected over decades. I wandered in, restless and looking for purpose, and offered to help. She politely declined. I persisted, suggesting ways to streamline the process, to make it more efficient. Finally, in a moment of weakness, she let me take over the meat sauce. I approached it like a logistics problem. Optimal timing for browning the meat, strategic layering of ingredients, measured intervals for stirring. I was trying to optimize a process that Helen had elevated to art. The sauce was perfectly adequate. Helen ate it without complaint. But something in her eyes had dimmed, and I realized I'd stolen something from her. The quiet satisfaction of creating something beautiful with her own hands, in her own time, in her own way. I'd turned her peaceful kitchen ritual into a corporate efficiency exercise. That night, she went to bed early. I found her in the bathroom, quietly crying as she brushed her teeth. "I miss who we used to be," she said when she saw me in the mirror. "I miss who you used to be." Mark and I had several uncomfortable conversations during this period. Phone calls where I'd offer advice about his work challenges, drawing from my decades of experience. But business had evolved. The challenges he faced, managing remote teams, navigating social media crises, dealing with a generation of employees who prioritized work-life balance, these were problems my experience hadn't prepared me for. "Dad, that's not really how it works anymore," became his standard response to my suggestions. Each time he said it, I felt myself becoming more obsolete, more irrelevant. There was a fishing trip with my old colleague Tom Morrison, both of us recently retired, both of us trying to recreate some version of male bonding we'd seen in movies. We sat in his boat on Lake George for 6 hours, casting lines and making awkward conversation about the old days. Every story we told made us sound more like dinosaurs reminiscing about an extinct world. "We were something back then, weren't we?" Tom said as we packed up our unused tackle. "Yeah," I agreed, "we were." The past tense hung between us like a verdict. Helen and I started sleeping on different schedules. She'd always been a night owl, reading in bed until 11 or midnight. I'd always been an early riser, asleep by 9:30, up before dawn. When I was working, this difference in rhythm was barely noticeable. I was usually at the office before she woke up anyway. But now, with both of us home, our mismatched body clocks became a metaphor for how out of sync we'd become in every other way. The breaking point came at Jim Hartwell's funeral. Jim had been our chief financial officer, a sharp, witty man who'd been forced into early retirement by a heart attack at 62. The church was full of our former colleagues, all of us in our best suits, all of us looking slightly lost. During the service, Jim's son spoke about his father's final years, how retirement had liberated him, how he'd discovered a passion for woodworking, how he'd become the grandfather who was always available for school plays and soccer games. He'd reinvented himself completely, found joy in small things, learned to measure success in smiles instead of spreadsheets. I sat in that pew, listening to the story of a man who'd successfully navigated the transition I was failing so spectacularly, and felt a crushing sense of my own inadequacy. Jim had figured out how to be useful in his retirement. I was just taking up space. Hit the like button if this part hits home for you. If you've ever felt that sting, that quiet erasure. The confrontation, when truth cuts deep. It was a Tuesday evening. I remember because the garbage bins were lined up on the curb like patient soldiers, and the autumn air carried the smell of burning leaves from somewhere down the street. The kitchen was warm from the oven, filled with the aroma of Helen's pot roast and the lingering scent of the vanilla candle she always lit during dinner. Mark was over for his monthly family dinner, a tradition Helen had instituted to ensure we still saw our son regularly now that my office was no longer a reason for him to call. He was stressed about a major client presentation, a pharmaceutical company threatening to pull a multi-million-dollar contract over some regulatory compliance issue that was tying his firm in knots. I watched him pace in the living room, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice carrying that particular edge of controlled desperation I remembered from my own crisis calls. His jaw was clenched, his free hand gesturing at invisible problems. When he hung up, he ran both hands through his hair, a gesture he'd inherited from me, and let out a long breath. In the kitchen, I was cleaning up. the dish towel thrown over my shoulder in the unconscious way of a man trying to be useful. Helen was wrapping leftovers, moving around me with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to work around obstacles. Mark came in, loosening his tie, and slumped into one of the kitchen chairs. "This is going to kill me," he said. "Morrison Pharmaceuticals wants a complete audit trail for every shipment over the past 3 years. We're talking thousands of documents, multiple warehouses, different tracking systems that don't talk to each other. And here's where I made my mistake. I saw an opening, a chance to be useful again, to demonstrate that I still had value. I set down the plate I was drying and turned to face my son. "You know," I said, my voice taking on the confident tone I'd once used in boardrooms. "Back in 03, we had a similar situation with Hartman Industries. Different sector, same problem, multiple systems, scattered documentation. What we did was create a parallel tracking matrix, pulled key personnel from each warehouse to act as liaisons, and ran a systematic reconciliation over a 2-week period. I was warming up now, feeling that old familiar surge of expertise. You could probably cut the timeline in half if you prioritize the high-value shipments first. Use those to demonstrate compliance while you work through the smaller batches. And if you're dealing with different tracking systems, there are middleware solutions now that can Dad." Mark's voice cut through my explanation like a blade. "Stop." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something in his expression that made my stomach drop. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was something worse. Pity mixed with exasperation, the look you give someone who's embarrassing themselves and doesn't know it. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, controlled. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but each word landed like a physical blow. "Dad, that's not how it works anymore. That was 20 years ago. These are different problems, different regulations, different technologies. Just..." He paused, and in that pause, I heard him making a decision. "Just leave it." He looked me up and down then, at the dish towel over my shoulder, at my comfortable worn-out slippers, at the eager expression that was probably still lingering on my face. His gaze took inventory of what I'd become. A man in a kitchen, trying desperately to insert himself into a world that had moved on without him. And then he delivered the line that would change everything. "You're useless now, you just don't get it." Useless. The word hung in the air between us, toxic and final. It didn't feel like an insult thrown in anger. It felt like a verdict, a diagnosis. The word hit me like a physical force. My hand, still holding the plate, trembled slightly. The warm water from the sink suddenly felt ice, cold against my fingertips. I looked at Mark, this man who used to climb into my lap to hear bedtime stories, who used to look at me like I could solve any problem, fix anything broken, and saw a stranger delivering a professional assessment. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't even angry. He was simply stating what he believed to be fact. I was useless. My expertise was obsolete. My advice was unwanted. My very presence was an irritation. Helen had gone very still at the counter. The only sound was the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant whisper of cars passing on the street outside. Mark seemed to realize what he'd said because his face softened slightly. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm stressed. But I need to handle this myself, okay?" He grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair. "Thanks for dinner, Mom." He kissed Helen's cheek and left without looking at me again. I heard his car start in the driveway, heard it pull away into the evening. I stood there in the warm kitchen, the dish towel still draped over my shoulder, looking out at the perfectly manicured lawn, the trimmed hedges, the 2-car garage. I saw a lifetime of achievement, and in that moment, it all looked like a beautifully decorated prison. Helen and I didn't speak for the rest of the evening. She finished cleaning the kitchen around me while I stood motionless, replaying the conversation, trying to find a different interpretation of my son's words. But there wasn't one. It was the silent fear I'd been carrying for 2 years, finally given a voice. That night, Helen came downstairs to find me still sitting at the kitchen table in the dark. "He didn't mean it," she said softly. "Yes, he did." I looked up at her, this woman who'd shared my life for 38 years, who'd stood by me through every promotion and crisis and late-night phone call, and he was right. The decision, when a logistics expert plans his own disappearance, I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark next to Helen, listening to her gentle breathing, and my mind did something strange. It didn't replay the argument. It didn't wallow in hurt. Instead, it began to calculate, to plan. The old logistics expert woke up, but this time he wasn't planning a distribution route for consumer goods. He was planning an escape route for a soul. At 3:17 a.m., I gave up on sleep and slipped downstairs to my home office. I opened my laptop and began to research with the same methodical precision I'd once applied to supply chain problems. RV dealers, long-term campgrounds, routes through the American Southwest. I made lists, something that had always calmed me in times of crisis. What to take, what to leave behind, how to explain my departure without sounding like a man having a breakdown. Because this wasn't a breakdown. This was strategic planning. The question had shifted from how could he say that to is he right? And if the answer was yes, if I truly was useless here, a constant reminder of my own obsolescence, then the solution wasn't to argue the point. It was to remove the problem. If I stayed, if I continued to orbit my family as a ghost of my former self, offering unwanted advice and taking up emotional space, then Mark's assessment would become a self-fulfilling prophecy. I would remain useless, diminishing in their eyes and my own, until I became nothing more than a burden to be managed and endured. But what if I left? What if I disappeared from their frame of reference entirely? Would they miss the man I'd been, or just feel relief at no longer having to accommodate the man I'd become? By sunrise, I had a plan, not a complete one. I was mapping unknown territory now, but a plan nonetheless. I would buy a travel trailer. I would drive west. I would find out if there was anything left of Arthur Bell that wasn't dependent on an office, a title, or the need to be needed. Helen found me at the computer at 6:30 a.m., still in yesterday's clothes, surrounded by printed pages from RV dealer websites. "What are you doing?" she asked, though her voice suggested she already suspected. I turned to face her, this woman who'd built a life with me, who'd raised our children and managed our household, and somehow remained beautiful at 64. I owed her honesty. "I'm planning to disappear for a while." She sat down in the chair across from my desk, her hands folded in her lap, and waited for me to explain. "Helen, what I'm becoming here is a burden to you and a ghost to myself. Mark was right, I'm useless now, but maybe I don't have to stay that way. Maybe I can find out if there's anything of me left that's worth something." She was quiet for a long time, studying the printouts scattered across my desk. "Where will you go?" "I don't know yet. West, I think. Somewhere I can think without everyone watching me fail at retirement. For how long? I don't know that either." She started crying then, not the dramatic sobs of a movie scene, but the quiet tears of a woman who'd seen this moment coming and had been dreading it. "I've been watching you disappear for 2 years," she said. "Maybe leaving is the only way for you to come back." That morning, we drove to Hartwell RV Sales. I'd researched the models online, narrowed it down to 3 options. But when I saw the 20-foot Airstream sitting in the lot, that perfect silver bullet gleaming in the morning sun, I knew it was the one. It looked like what it was, a vehicle for transformation, a cocoon on wheels. The salesman, a cheerful man named Pete, who'd probably sold thousands of dreams to restless retirees, walked us through the interior. Compact but efficient. Everything had its place. Every space had multiple purposes. It was the opposite of our rambling suburban house with its excess rooms and accumulated possessions. "Popular with the snowbirds," Pete said. Lot of folks your age looking for freedom, you know. Kids grown up, careers winding down. Time to see what's out there. Helen ran her hand along the small dining table that converted into a bed. It's so small, she said. Small enough. I agreed. We bought it that afternoon. Helen insisted on paying half, which we both understood was her way of giving permission for something that frightened her. If you're still here listening, don't forget to subscribe. It really helps. This journey, it's one I think more people need to hear about. The departure, dawn of a different life. I had planned to leave on a Tuesday morning. There was something fitting about beginning this journey on the same day of the week that Mark had called me useless. But Helen asked for one more day, and I gave it to her. She spent that final evening packing a bag for me with the same care she'd once used to pack Mark's luggage for summer camp. She folded my clothes with precision, including shirts I hadn't worn in years but that she knew I loved. She packed my tools in a canvas roll, the good ones, the ones that had built our deck and countless home repairs. She included books I'd started but never finished, a thermos that had accompanied me on thousands of early morning commutes, and a photo of the two of us from our honeymoon in Maine. Her hands trembled as she worked, but she didn't cry. Not then. She was focused on the task, approaching it like the project manager she'd been before Mark was born. Systematic, thorough, making sure I had everything I'd need. "You'll call every Sunday?" she asked, zipping the suitcase closed. "Every Sunday, and you'll come home if this doesn't work out." I took her hands in mine. They were soft, familiar, marked with the small scars of a life spent caring for others. "Helen, what if it does work out? What if I figure out how to be useful again? Then we'll figure out what comes next." That night, we lay in bed together without speaking, not sleeping, just lying in the darkness, memorizing the weight of each other's presence. At some point, Helen reached over and took my hand. "I'm proud of you," she whispered, "for being brave enough to try." I woke at 4:30 a.m., earlier than my usual alarm. The house was still dark, filled with the pre-dawn hush that had once been my favorite time of day. I showered quietly, dressed in clothes Helen had laid out the night before. Jeans and a flannel shirt, the uniform of a man no longer bound by corporate dress codes. Helen appeared in the kitchen as I was making coffee, wrapped in her favorite robe, her hair still mussed from sleep. She looked younger somehow, or maybe more fragile. We drank coffee together in silence, watching the sky slowly lighten through the window. When it came time to hitch the Airstream to my SUV, she stood in the driveway and watched me check the connections, test the lights, adjust the mirrors. The mechanical ritual was soothing, each step a small confirmation that this was really happening. I walked through the house one last time, not sentimentally, but systematically, like a man conducting a final inspection. The living room where we'd watched Mark take his first steps. The kitchen where we'd shared thousands of meals and conversations. The bedroom where we'd made love and made plans and made compromises for nearly 4 decades. It was still our house, still beautiful, still full of memories, but it no longer felt like the place where I belonged. It felt like a museum of a life I'd finished living. Helen walked me to the truck. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew and possibility. She kissed me on the cheek, a soft, lingering benediction. "Find yourself out there," she said, "then come home and introduce us." I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The Airstream trembled slightly, then settled into line behind the truck. In the rear-view mirror, I could see Helen standing on the driveway in her robe, one hand shading her eyes from the rising sun. I didn't look back again. Looking back is a luxury for those who are still wanted. I was a man on a mission to become wanted again, if only by himself. The first hour on the highway was surreal. Every mile put more distance between me and the life I'd known. As the suburbs gave way to farmland and the farmland gave way to rolling hills, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The sensation of moving towards something unknown rather than running from something familiar. I stopped for breakfast at a truck stop outside Albany, a sprawling complex of diesel pumps and fluorescent lights that catered to the anonymous army of America's roads. I sat at the counter next to drivers who knew nothing about me except that I was traveling west with an Airstream. No one asked about my career or my retirement or my family. I was just another customer ordering coffee and eggs, and the anonymity felt like freedom. The road, lessons from the interstate the first few weeks were a blur of interstate highways and self-imposed isolation. I'd driven across the country dozens of times for work, but I'd never really seen it. This time I did. I stopped when I wanted to stop. I slept in Walmart parking lots, a vast network of temporary refuges for wandering souls, and woke to the sound of semi-trucks rumbling to life in the pre-dawn darkness. It was a sound that had once been the soundtrack of my stress, the background noise of logistics problems and delivery deadlines. Now it was a lullaby of anonymity, proof that the world's commerce continued without my orchestration. In Ohio, I met a trucker named Miguel at a rest stop outside Columbus. He was hauling auto parts to Phoenix, making the same run he'd been making for 15 years. We stood side by side at the vending machines, two men taking a break from long journeys. "First time with a trailer?" he asked, nodding toward my setup. "First time with a lot of things," he laughed. "Retirement road trip, something like that." "Well, take some advice from a guy who's been driving these roads for 20 years. Don't be in a hurry to get where you're going. The road's got things to teach you, but only if you're paying attention." In Kansas, I stayed 3 days at a family-owned RV park run by a couple in their 70s named Bill and Martha. They'd been hosting travelers for 40 years, watching thousands of people pass through their small corner of the prairie. Bill helped me adjust my hitch setup, showing me tricks he'd learned from decades of helping wayward travelers. "You running from something or towards something?" Martha asked over coffee in their office, decorated with postcards from grateful visitors. "I'm honestly not sure. That's the most honest answer I've heard in a while. Most folks know exactly what they're running from. Takes courage to admit you don't know what you're running toward." I broke down outside Albuquerque, not emotionally, though that would come later, but mechanically. A bearing in the Airstream's wheel assembly failed, leaving me stranded at a gas station in the high desert. The mechanic, a weathered man named Carlos, who spoke English with a melodic New Mexican accent, diagnosed the problem and told me it would take 2 days to get parts. "You could fly back to wherever you came from," he suggested. "Have someone else deal with this." But I didn't want to fly anywhere. I wanted to learn how to fix things, to solve problems with my hands instead of my phone. Carlos let me work alongside him, teaching me about bearings and hubs and the simple satisfaction of repairing something broken. "You ever work with your hands before?" he asked, watching me fumble with a wrench. Mostly I worked with my head. Nothing wrong with that, but there's something different about fixing something you can touch, something real about it. When the repair was finished and I tried to pay him, Carlos waved off half my money. "You did the work too. Besides, you learned something. That's worth more than money." I drove through Monument Valley at sunrise, and the sight of those massive red monoliths rising from the desert floor made me pull over and simply sit. I'd seen photographs, of course, but nothing had prepared me for the scale, the ancient dignity of those formations. They'd been standing for millions of years, watching civilizations rise and fall, utterly indifferent to human schedules and ambitions. My phone buzzed, an email from Helen. She'd started sending me daily messages, small updates about her life, photos of flowers in the garden, reports on books she was reading. They were lifelines, keeping me connected to love without tethering me to obligation. "Joined a watercolor class today," she wrote. "Terrible at it, but loving every minute. Miss you, but proud of what you're doing. Be safe." I wrote back, learning to fix trailer bearings in New Mexico. Who knew I had mechanic hands? "The desert is teaching me about time and scale. Still figuring out what that means. Love you." In a diner outside Flagstaff, I sat next to a woman about my age who was also traveling alone. She'd been a high school principal in Michigan, recently retired, taking what she called a sanity preservation tour of the Southwest. My husband died 3 years ago, she told me over coffee and apple pie. Spent 2 years being the sad widow, and then I realized I had a choice. I could keep being sad, or I could figure out who I am when nobody needs me to be anything in particular. Which did you choose? I bought a motorhome and started driving. Best decision I ever made. Turns out I'm pretty good company when I'm not trying to be what everyone else expects. She drove away that morning heading for California, and I never saw her again. But her words stayed with me. Who am I when nobody needs me to be anything in particular? Sedona. Arrival at the edge of transformation. I first saw Sedona from Highway 17, and the sight literally made me stop the truck. Rising from the high desert like ancient cathedrals, the red rock formations seemed to glow with their own inner light. This wasn't just landscape. It was architecture on a geological scale, carved by forces that made human ambition look like children's sandcastles. I didn't stay in Sedona proper. The town was beautiful but crowded with tourists and spiritual seekers and wealthy retirees who'd turned the desert into an outdoor shopping mall. Instead, I found a long-term RV park 15 miles outside town, a simple patch of gravel and desert scrub called Red Rock Haven, managed by a former park ranger named Dale, who understood the difference between solitude and loneliness. Most folks stay a month or two, Dale said as he showed me to my spot, but some stay longer. Desert gets into your blood after a while, changes how you see things. My spot was a level patch of ground with hookups for water and electricity, surrounded by nothing but red earth and scattered juniper trees. To the west, the massive bulk of Thunder Mountain rose like a sleeping giant. To the east, the Sedona red rocks caught the light and held it like precious stones. Setting up the airstream had become routine by now, but this time felt different. This wasn't just another stop on a wandering journey. This was arrival. I leveled the trailer, connected the utilities, extended the awning, and arranged my few belongings with the care of a man who might be staying a while. That first night, I sat outside on my folding chair and watched the sunset paint the rocks in shades of gold and crimson and deep purple. The silence here was different from the accusatory quiet of my suburban kitchen. This was ancient silence, generous silence. It had room for me, but the transition wasn't immediate or easy. The first week was filled with profound loneliness. I'd wake in the narrow bed of the airstream, and for a moment forget where I was, reaching instinctively for Helen's warm presence. I'd make coffee in my tiny kitchen, and miss the ritual of reading the morning paper at our kitchen table, while Helen moved around me in her morning routine. The other residents of Red Rock Haven were mostly older couples in large motorhomes, snowbirds escaping northern winters. They were polite but distant, wrapped up in their own retirement adventures. I felt conspicuously alone, the single man in the silver bullet who'd come here without a plan or a partner. Sedona, the slow architecture of transformation. I started taking long walks in the desert, partly for exercise but mostly because sitting still made me think too much. At first, my mind was still a boardroom, replaying old meetings, old victories, old failures. I'd walk for miles mentally reorganizing supply chains that no longer needed my attention. But the desert doesn't care about your quarterly reports. The wind and the sun and the vast indifferent sky slowly sanded away those thoughts. I began to notice things, the way a hawk rode thermal currents, expending no energy, just trusting the wind, the intricate architecture of a cactus wren's nest, the way light changed the color of the cliffs from blood, red to soft pink in the space of an hour. My neighbor in the spot next to mine was a woman named Betty, traveling alone in a vintage Winnebago that looked like it had seen every mile of America. She'd been a nurse in Denver for 40 years, And she had that particular brand of practical kindness that comes from a lifetime of helping people through their worst moments. "You're running from something," she observed one morning as we both made coffee outside our rigs. "Is it that obvious? Honey, I've been a nurse for 4 decades. I know the difference between someone who's traveling towards something and someone who's traveling away from something. The question is, have you figured out the difference yet?" Betty's awning had been giving her trouble for weeks, collapsing at random moments and requiring a complicated procedure involving bungee cords and creative profanity to extend. I'd watched her struggle with it daily, but it took me 3 weeks to work up the courage to offer help. When I finally did, she accepted with the graciousness of someone who understood that helping her was helping me. The problem was simple: a bent support arm that needed to be straightened and reinforced. I spent a morning with my tools, working in the desert sun, feeling the satisfaction of solving a problem with my hands instead of my intellect. "That's the best it's worked in years," Betty said when we tested the repair. "What did you do for work?" "Logistics. Move things around on paper mostly." "Well, you're pretty good at moving things around in real life too." Word got around the RV park that I was handy with repairs. A week later, a young couple in an ancient VW bus asked if I could look at their engine, which had been running rough since Tucson. Jake and Emma were in their late 20s, artists from Portland who decided to spend a year living in their van and selling Jake's paintings at craft fairs. The van was a mechanical disaster, a testament to optimism over common sense, but it was also a work of art, painted with swirling designs and fitted out with ingenious space-saving solutions. Jake had built a bed that converted to a dining table, storage compartments that served multiple purposes, a tiny kitchen that could produce surprisingly elaborate meals. We bought it from a hippie in Eugene who swore it would make it to Mexico, Jake said as I peered into the engine compartment. "So far, it's made it to Arizona, which feels like progress." The engine problems were straightforward: dirty fuel injectors, a clogged air filter, spark plugs that hadn't been changed since the Clinton administration. But working on the van became about more than automotive repair. Jake and Emma had an infectious enthusiasm for their nomadic life, a joy in small pleasures that reminded me of something I'd lost. "Why did you leave Portland?" I asked as we waited for parts to arrive. "Everyone there has a plan," Emma said. 5-year plans, 10-year plans, retirement plans. We wanted to find out what would happen if we didn't have a plan for a while, and what's happened. We're learning that we're different people when we're not trying to be the people we thought we should be. I started spending evenings with Jake and Emma, sharing simple meals cooked on camp stoves, listening to them talk about their travels, their art, their dreams that weren't tied to corporate ladders or suburban expectations. They called me Art, the first time anyone had shortened my name in years, and somehow that simple syllable felt like a liberation from the formal weight of Arthur Bell, vice president. Around this time, I started whittling. Not because I had any artistic ambition, but because my hands needed something to do during the long desert evenings. I bought a set of carving tools in town and started with pieces of juniper wood I collected on my walks. My first attempts were disasters, formless lumps that might charitably be called abstract art. But there was something meditative about the process, about finding the shape hidden within the wood, about creating something beautiful with nothing but patience and attention. An old man named Frank, who lived in the park year-round, saw me struggling with a piece one evening and offered advice. He'd been a cabinet maker in Phoenix before retirement, and his hands still remembered the language of wood and blade. "You're fighting the wood," he observed, watching me wrestle with a stubborn piece of pine. "You can't force it to be what you want. You have to find out what it wants to be and help it get there." Under Frank's patient guidance, I learned to read the grain, to work with the wood's natural inclinations rather than against them. I carved simple figures at first, birds, fish, abstract shapes that pleased my hands even if they weren't masterpieces. The real breakthrough came when I carved a small hawk, inspired by the one I'd been watching ride the thermals above my campsite. It wasn't perfect, but it captured something essential about the bird's grace, its mastery of effortless flight. When I showed it to Frank, he smiled. "Now you're learning. That bird took you where it wanted to go, didn't it?" I started giving away my carvings, small gifts for people who'd show me kindness. Betty got a desert flower. Jake and Emma got matching roadrunners for their van's dashboard. Each piece was a small thank you note carved in wood, a way of saying that their presence in my life had mattered. Share your thoughts in the comments. I read them all. I'm curious, when was the moment you realized you had to change your own story? Helen's journey, two people rediscovering themselves, our weekly phone calls, became the anchor points of my week, but they evolved in unexpected ways. At first, we talked about logistics, how I was eating, whether the trailer was holding up, what the weather was like. Safe topics that avoided the deeper questions of what this separation meant for us. But gradually, our conversations became more interesting. Helen started telling me about changes in her own life. She'd taken up watercolor painting, something she'd always wanted to try but never had time for. She joined a book club that met at the library, reading novels and poetry that had nothing to do with practical concerns. She'd started taking walks in the park behind our house, discovering paths that had been there for years but that she'd never noticed. "I cleaned out your office last week," she told me during one call. "Turned it into a studio. I hope that's okay." "It's your house too, Helen. It always was." "I know, but I never really lived in it that way. I was always accommodating your schedule, your needs, your space. It's strange, learning to arrange things for my own convenience." She was painting, she told me, watercolors of flowers from her garden, landscapes from photographs she'd taken on her walks. They weren't museum quality, but they brought her joy in a way that surprised her. I'd forgotten what it felt like to make something just because I wanted to, she said, not because it needed to be done, not because someone expected it, just because the making of it made me happy. During one call, about 3 months into my desert exile, Helen said something that changed everything. "I think I understand why you had to leave. Do you?" You weren't the only one who'd forgotten who you were. I'd forgotten too. I'd become so focused on being the wife of Arthur Bell, the mother of Mark and Emily, that I'd stopped being Helen. These past few months, living alone, I'm remembering her. She's different than I expected. Different how? Braver, more interesting, less worried about what everyone thinks. I like her. I realized that our separation had given both of us something we hadn't known we needed. Permission to be ourselves without consideration for what the other person expected or required. We were falling in love again, not as the people we'd become for each other over 40 years of marriage, but as the people we were becoming for ourselves. The dark night, when doubt nearly won. Not every moment in the desert was enlightenment and personal growth. There was a night in early December, about 6 months into my stay, when the loneliness hit me like a physical force. It had been a difficult day. I'd received an email from Mark, his first direct communication since that terrible evening in the kitchen. It was brief, formal, the kind of message you might send to a distant relative. "Dad, Mom told me where you are. Hope you're doing well. The Morrison pharmaceutical situation worked out. We kept the contract. Thought you should know. No apology, no acknowledgement of the words that had driven me into exile, no invitation to come home, just a cool professional update, as if I were a former colleague he occasionally remembered. That night, I sat outside my trailer looking up at the impossible blanket of desert stars and felt utterly lost. What was I doing here? What had I accomplished except to prove that I could run away from my problems? I missed Helen with a physical ache. I missed my comfortable bed, my familiar routines, the simple pleasure of being known by the people around me. I'd been in Arizona for half a year, and what did I have to show for it? A few amateur wood carvings, some mechanical skills, the friendship of a handful of fellow wanderers who would scatter back to their own lives when winter ended. Meanwhile, my real life, my family, my marriage, my home, was dissolving in my absence. I actually started the truck that night. Sat behind the wheel at 2 a.m. with the engine running, the Airstream hitched and ready to go. I could be home in 3 days. I could walk into my kitchen, apologize for this foolish adventure, and try to figure out how to be the man Helen and Mark needed me to be, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the memory of Frank's words about working with wood. You can't force it to be what you want. You have to find out what it wants to be and help it get there. Maybe it was the realization that going home now would mean accepting Mark's verdict as final. I would return as the useless old man who'd tried to find meaning and failed, confirming everyone's suspicions that I was too old, too stubborn, too set in my ways to change. Or maybe it was simply that the desert stars were so beautiful, so infinite, that my problems seemed properly scaled for the first time in years. The universe was reminding me of my size, not to diminish me, but to free me from the terrible weight of thinking I was the center of anyone's world. I turned off the engine and went back to bed. In the morning, I would continue the slow work of becoming whoever I was meant to be next. Mark's arrival, when the prodigal son finds the prodigal father, it was a Tuesday morning in late February, almost exactly 1 year after the confrontation that had started this journey. I was outside the Airstream, working on a carving of a coyote I'd been observing during my morning walks, when I heard a familiar engine sound echoing across the desert. A dark blue SUV was winding its way through the RV park, moving slowly as if the driver was searching for something or someone. When it stopped at my campsite and Mark got out, I felt a complex surge of emotions, joy, fear, anger, hope, all tangled together in my chest. He looked different, older, obviously. It had been a year, but also softer somehow. The hard-edged executive persona he'd worn like armor was gone, replaced by something more uncertain, more human. He was wearing jeans and a simple button-down shirt, clothes for traveling rather than impressing. "Hello, Dad. Hello, Mark." We stood there for a moment, two men who shared a name and a history, but weren't sure how to bridge the distance between them. Finally, Mark gestured toward the Airstream. Could we talk? I put down my carving tools and led him inside the trailer. It was cramped with both of us there, but somehow the small space felt intimate rather than confining. I made coffee, the ritual of hospitality giving us both something to do with our hands. "How did you find me?" "Mom told me where you were. She's been keeping track." He accepted the coffee mug gratefully. "She's worried about you. We both are." "I'm fine, Mark." "Better than fine, actually." He looked around the tiny interior of the trailer, taking in the miniature kitchen, the fold-out table, the narrow bed. His expression was unreadable. "This is what you left us for." This, for a moment, I felt the old anger rising. Here he was again, judging my choices, dismissing my life as inadequate. But then I looked more closely at his face and saw something I'd missed. He wasn't judging. He was trying to understand. "I didn't leave for this, Mark. I left because of what you said, and you were right." His face crumpled. "Dad, let me finish. The man you were talking to that night, the man who was standing in your mother's kitchen offering unwanted advice about problems he didn't understand. That man was useless. He had outlived his purpose and didn't know how to find a new one." I gestured toward the small window that framed a perfect view of Thunder Mountain. "You didn't break me, son. You woke me up. You gave me the kick I needed to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to be who I used to be." Mark was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I've been in therapy. Helen mentioned that. Dr. Martinez, she's good, really good. She helped me understand some things about myself, about us, about what I said to you." He looked up at me, and I saw tears in his eyes. "Dad, I was angry at you for becoming what I was afraid I'd become. Irrelevant, forgotten, useless. He told me about his year, about how my disappearance had created a void he couldn't ignore, about how he'd started therapy, initially to deal with work stress, but increasingly to understand the rage he directed at me that night, about how he'd recognized his own frantic drive as a fear of ending up like the man he thought I'd become. I was chasing a ghost, he said, trying so hard to stay relevant, to stay needed, that I couldn't see I was turning into the same ghost. The same desperate, obsolete man I accused you of being. He'd had his own crisis 6 months earlier, a panic attack in the middle of a client presentation, followed by 3 days in the hospital for what the doctors assured him was anxiety, not a heart attack. His marriage to Jennifer was struggling. They'd been so focused on their careers that they'd forgotten to focus on each other. Jenny and I are in couples therapy now. It's helping. But one of the things we realized is that we were both so afraid of ending up like our parents, stuck, disappointed, diminished, that we never asked what our parents were really like, who they really were. He gestured around the Airstream, so I came to find out who my father really is. I gave him a tour of my small domain, showed him the mechanical improvements I'd made, the spot where I did my morning coffee ritual, the folding chair where I sat to watch sunsets. I introduced him to Betty, who invited him to dinner. I showed him my wood carvings, explaining the meditation of finding shapes hidden in raw material. That evening, we cooked together on my camp stove, a simple meal of grilled chicken and vegetables, but it felt sacramental somehow. We were sharing space, working together without hierarchy or competition, just two men preparing food and talking. "Tell me about the business," I said as we ate, not because I wanted to offer advice, but because I genuinely wanted to know about his life. He talked about the challenges of managing remote teams, about the complexity of modern regulatory environments, about clients who expected miracles on impossible timelines. His problems were different from the ones I'd faced, but the underlying stress was familiar. The Morrison pharmaceutical thing, he said, we solved it, but not the way you suggested. I figured, different world now, but you know what? We could have used your help, not your old solutions, but your experience, your perspective. I was too proud and too angry to see that. We talked until late into the night, about masculinity and aging, about what it means to be useful versus what it means to be whole, about the difference between being needed and being loved, about the terror of irrelevance that drives so many men cling to identities that no longer serve them. "I'm sorry, Dad," Mark said finally, "what I said to you that night. It was horrible, and it was wrong." "No," I said, "it was true. But sometimes the truth is exactly what you need to hear, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts." He started crying then, not the tears of a man ashamed of his emotions, but the honest grief of someone finally allowing himself to feel. I held him, this son who'd grown up while I wasn't paying attention, who'd become a man while I was busy being important. "I missed you," he said. "I missed you too." Mark stayed for 3 days. He met my RV park neighbors, helped Jake and Emma with some electrical problems in their van, tried his hand at whittling under Frank's patient instruction. He seemed to understand that this wasn't just a place I'd been hiding. It was a place where I'd been rebuilding. On his last evening, we sat outside the Airstream watching the sunset paint the red rocks in impossible colors. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable anymore, it was companionable, the quiet of two people who'd found their way back to understanding. "Are you coming home?" he asked, eventually. "But not as the man who left. And not because you need me to. When I'm ready to be a visitor in my own life instead of a prisoner in it." Reflections on masculinity and worth living in the desert for over a year gave me time to think about the peculiar challenges of being a man in modern America, particularly a man whose usefulness is tied to systems and institutions that inevitably move on without him. We teach boys to build their identities around doing rather than being. We measure ourselves by our productivity, our problem, solving capacity, our ability to provide and protect and fix things. These aren't bad qualities, but they become prisons when they're the only qualities we recognize in ourselves, when the doing stops, through retirement, layoffs, injury, or simply the natural evolution of the world. Men like me face an existential crisis that our culture doesn't prepare us for. We've spent decades being human doings instead of human beings, and suddenly we're asked to find value in existence itself rather than in accomplishment. The desert taught me about different kinds of time. Corporate time is linear, urgent, measurable in quarters and deadlines and deliverables. Desert time is cyclical, patient, measured in seasons and weather patterns, and the slow erosion of stone. Both kinds of time have their place, but I'd forgotten that the second kind even existed.